I like to yell. So I said, one of the things I want you guys to do for me is to pray. I'm in the middle of writing a textbook, but it's a little bit different than normal textbooks. It's a textbook for 9th, 10th graders, and it is real science. It is a science textbook. Your kids will be able to read it, pass the standardized test, but it is coming at everything from a biblical worldview. I believe firmly that our kids can have a strong belief in God, they can believe in the Bible, and still learn great science. So please keep that in your prayers. It is writing a textbook's a little bit harder than I thought it was when I sat down to start this about a year ago. Writing books is laborious anyway, but when you're writing textbooks, it's a true challenge, so to speak. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the guy who got all of this started. And the reason that I want to spend some time talking about him, number one, we need to at least acknowledge what he's done. But number two, I want you to think about, people ask me this question. Brad, if we're not immediately taken to heaven when we die, if there's going to be this judgment day later on, but yet we know kind of what our fate is, why would we then have a judgment day later on? Charles Darwin died over 100 years ago, but we're still reaping fruit from his bad theory today. And he's going to be held accountable for it. I'm firmly convinced of that. He was born in 1809. Mom died when he was very, very young. He was raised primarily by his father, who was a well-known physician. Okay? His grandfather was also a well-known physician there in England. Guess what Charles Darwin was expected to be? A physician. He was supposed to follow in their footsteps, keep up the family name. So at the tender age of 16, they sent him off to the University of Edinburgh to be a doctor. And lo and behold, guess what? Found out he couldn't really do blood. Okay? He discovered that was not the job for him. He tells his dad, look, can't do it. His dad says, all right. There's one job, one career that would save the family name. That is, if you become a priest, a preacher. So they packed him up, they sent him off to Cambridge, where he received his only degree in theology. Now, let that sink into your minds a little bit. This guy who the mass media has elevated as a scientific god of our all time, his only degree was in the Bible. While he's at Cambridge, he meets a guy by the name of John Stephen Henslow. Henslow was a priest. He was a professor at the school. He was also a botanist. He liked to go out and collect plants. He would take Charles Darwin with him. They would go out, they would collect various species. And he realized that Charles Darwin had a knack for identifying new species, new things. So he got him a job the year he graduated from Cambridge. It was supposed to be a 2-year job on a boat, the HMS Beagle. Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. 2 years, ended up being 5 years, and on that 5-year journey, Charles Darwin learned 2 things. He learned, number one, he was very, very prone to seasickness. Because when you read his biography, he spent a lot of time in the bottom of that boat throwing up. He also discovered he had a really good knack for collecting things. Every time that boat would hit the land, he'd jump off, he'd go out, he'd collect as much as he could, preserve it, ship it back to England. And onward they'd go. So they go down around the tip of South America. They come up the coast, they hit Ecuador, and then they headed due west on the equator. 500 miles later, they run into a group of islands known as the Galapagos Islands. I had the opportunity to go there not that long ago. Kind of was able to walk in the footsteps of Darwin. We filmed some stuff over there. Wanted to basically see what he saw firsthand. And I'll go ahead and tell every single one of you, There are things in the Galapagos, that's the only place in the world you're going to see them, okay? You got those massive tortoises that you can ride. Of course, you can see those, for instance, at your local zoo. But then you got other things that, honestly, it's like, wow, God got out a totally different series of paintbrushes when he did this one. I'll tell this because it's just kind of cool. One of the things we had to do was we had to film very early in the morning because while we weren't doing it secretly, there was some basically government issues about when we couldn't film. Long story short, me and this guy are up about 5 o'clock every morning. We're out on the beach by ourselves. We're filming. So if I look like I'm asleep in that video, understand, 5 o'clock. We walked out one morning and there was this trench on the beach. And it was pretty big. And we're looking at it going, what in the world? So we followed it all the way up until we saw one of these dudes right here. And this is not an exaggeration, over 5 feet long. Okay, really glad they're vegetarian. There are things that only you see in the Galapagos Islands. But the thing that really caught his eye were the finches. 13 different finches. And if you look at these pictures here, you'll notice definite differences in their beaks. Charles Darwin was fascinated. He collected 13 different ones while he was there. He wrapped them up, preserved them, shipped them back to England. They continued their journey. Roughly 4 years later, he gets back to England. He's going through all of his stuff. He pulls out his finches and he starts thinking, he's like, there is no way God would have put 13 different types of finches on these islands. Surely what happened is there was an original pair that somehow made it 500 miles from Ecuador. And from that pair, we get all these different varieties. So in his notes, literally what he drew was a branching diagram. That was his idea. That maybe, we get all these different. The problem is he took that idea and he then applied it to everything. And he said, you know what? Maybe everything came from a common ancestor. Now, let's go back to those finches for just a minute. We've been studying Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands for over 100 years. And there is, I grant you, there are population shifts. You get drought years. Maybe you get more with the thin beaks and all these different factors come into play. But in 100 years, those finches have never, ever, ever turned into something that's not a what? A finch. They're still finches. They're not like rhinoceros. They're not ferns. They're finches. So Charles Darwin writes his book, The Origin of Species. The full title you don't see in print anymore. Full title was The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races? What? Yeah, Charles Darwin actually believed white people were further evolved from dark-skinned folks. In his second book, The Descent of Man, he actually goes on to say, the Negro race is closer to the simian stem of monkeys. You don't really see that in the textbooks, do you? But you know what? Even though you don't read that, we're still teaching it. And let me tell you why I say that. Our kids are learning that man allegedly evolved out of Africa, the Afar region of Africa. We had long arms, lots of hair, dark skin, and lo and behold, hundreds of thousands of years later, finally, white man comes walking down out of Europe. Okay, I don't care how you look at it. What they're saying is white-skinned people are further evolved than darker-skinned people. Folks, that's racism. And what I want you to understand as we begin is, according to this book, there's only one race. It's called the human race. And God sent his son for all colors. And the sooner we start teaching our kids that and get away from this garbage. By the way, I'm one of those mean teachers. I used to teach at a preaching school, and we were talking about the origin of species. I asked them this question as a bonus. What is the one question Charles Darwin did not deal with and answer in his book? Answer? He never said what was the origin of species. I'm like, okay, you named your whole book The Origin of Species, yet you never named it. In his book, he makes this comment. He says, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Well, why don't we have missing links? He's right. Oh, we claim to. In fact, let me introduce you to a couple of different things that they would throw out as evolutionary icons. Like, for instance, well, before we do that, Dr. Colin Patterson was asked about why we don't have transitional fossils. This guy was the curator for the British Museum of Natural History. Look at his answer. He says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. Now, that's the curator for the British Museum of Natural History. Here's what they would point to. Things like this. Trilobite, index fossil. Proves everything's millions of years old. In fact, here's the way they look at it. Anywhere you find one of these things, they say that you're in the oldest layer of the earth. Okay? Before dinosaurs, before early mammals. So allegedly, if you find one of these guys, you're in a dirt layer 500 to 600 million years old. A couple problems with that. First problem is this guy actually has a more complex eye than you and I. Everybody in this room has a single refractory lens. He has an optical doublet. He has two lenses working together. Which means if we evolve from this guy right here, we're actually getting worse. We're like de-evolving because we've gone from two lenses to one. Other problem with that, in 1969, a guy by the name of William Meister, two of his colleagues, they were out looking for trilobite fossils. They climbed up a ledge in Antelope Springs, Utah. They're tapping open rocks. Meister hit one. It split into two beautiful halves, right? And he found two trilobites embedded in the sandal print of a human being. Okay, wait a second. How you got humans at the same time you got trilobites? Let me back up for just a second. Where on that timeline would humans supposedly be coming in at? Very top, right? According to evolutionists. Like we would come way after the reptile, the early mammals, and finally you got humans at the very, very top. And yet this guy finds a trilobite in the sandal print of a human. Are we still using this in textbooks today? Oh yeah, earlier this year, I'm in Oklahoma, right? They let me come teach in a public school. I'm there. I was like, hey, can I just borrow one of y'all's textbooks? So I plopped out their textbook. I'm going through it page by page, teaching on trilobites while in their textbook. Guess what they've got? Trilobites as an evolutionary icon. Now, just so that you understand the validity of this thing, I actually had them take it out of a lockbox in Texas, okay? Because I've been told that you can see the sandal stitching on this thing. Folks, there's no getting around it. It's a human sandal print with two trilobites in it. And ironically, the guy who owns it, he told me, he said, I've been offered over $1 million by evolutionists who told him all they want to do, destroy it. Now think about that for just a moment. If you've got a theory and you get evidence in that disproves your theory, which one do you give up? Do you give up your theory or do you give up the evidence? They're giving up the evidence. Or how about this one? On the screen, you see a picture. It's been used in countless thousands of textbooks. I'm going to kind of start over here in the bottom left-hand corner. You've got a fish, a salamander, turtle, chicken, pig, couple of mammals, finally a human, in 3 different stages of embryonic development. The guy who drew this initial one, his name was Ernst Haeckel. He drew it all the way back in 1874. Said his turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's book. He believed Darwin was right. Gotta be, evolution, common ancestor. In fact, if you really know your history, you know this guy went and visited Charles Darwin at his home there on the Mount. You say, all right, what's the big deal? What's the problem? Problem is, Ernst Haeckel was actually fired from the University of Jena for forging his pictures. They're total fakes. Look across that top row. You see how everything looks basically the same, doesn't it? He did that on purpose. You know why he did that on purpose? Because he was trying to communicate the idea that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Now, he was fired in the 1800s. Surely we wouldn't still be putting these pictures in textbooks today, right? Oh yeah, we've colorized them. We made them pretty. And yet, they're still teaching the same thing to our kids. By the way, on the screen behind me, you see across the top Haeckel's original drawings, and below that you've got the real McCoy. They don't look a whole lot alike, do they? Stephen Jay Gould commenting on it. Stephen Jay Gould, very well-known evolutionist, he wrote an article in Natural History magazine titled Atrocious, where he actually was rebuking the evolutionary community for continuing to use these embryos in textbooks. Look at what he says. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. He's saying for 100 years we've been mindlessly recycling this fake news. And yet we're still doing it today. Or how about this one? Horse evolution. The idea that, we started out with this little bitty guy 54 million years ago. He goes by 2 names, Eohippus and Hyracotherium. And so according to the textbooks, here's what happened. Over time, that little creature evolved up to a modern day horse. You see it in textbooks? Oh yeah, all over the place. All kinds of textbooks, modern textbooks. You see it in museums. I love this one because if you pay attention, take a look at the graphs above these horses. You'll notice it's measuring body size over time. Okay, so what these graphs are saying is, over time, this guy got a whole lot what? Okay, stop and think about that for a minute. If that is true, why do we have any small anything? I mean, why are mice not like this big? Because what they're showing up there is, over time, things get what? Why aren't humans about 10 feet tall? And yet again, we have dumbed down our kids to the point they don't even think about what that's really saying. Do we use it as evidence for evolution? Oh yeah. There's a picture from the British Museum of Natural History, 2012. Here's the interesting thing. It's not real. It's been totally fabricated, completely whole cloth out of the minds of evolutionists. Harrub Nielsen, who again, he's an evolutionist, he said this: the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. He says, in the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from 3 parts: of which only the last can be including horses. We knew that all the way back in 1954, and yet we keep putting it in their textbooks. Why? Because it sells the picture we want to sell. George Gaylord Simpson said this. He said, the uniform continuous transformation of Hyrcothrym, that little bitty guy, into modern day Equus or horse, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. And yet we keep on including it. What about this one? Vestigial structures. I can't tell you how many Christians I've had come up to me and say, but you know, Brad, we got all these parts that are left over that, you know, they kind of support evolution. Like you got like appendix, tonsils, stuff we shouldn't have. According to textbooks, all of that is traces of our evolutionary history, right? This one says, vestigial structures are remnants of an organism's evolutionary past. You notice it's got a picture of this whale. The whale's got these pelvic bones where supposedly it used to walk. They're not needed anymore. That's just, you know, that's a vestigial structure. Even though, listen to me, we have known for over 30 years that those bones in the whale, they actually serve a purpose for reproduction. They allow a male whale to contact and hold on to a female whale. They're actually used. But in the textbooks, they tell us, no, those are old legs. They don't use them anymore. Yeah, okay. Back in 1931, humans supposedly had 180 vestigial structures, 180 things that we thought we didn't need in our bodies. Thankfully, that list has gone down to 0. And yet, notice in this textbook, vestigial structures listed right beside those beautiful embryos, all to communicate to our kids that, hey, evolution is true. You got to believe it. All smart people believe it. Let me give you a real quick scenario why I think this is just rubbish, okay? You'll notice this textbook, 1989. That's an old one. Some of y'all in this room were in school in 1989. 1989, we're still teaching that the appendix is a vestigial structure, right? 1994 textbook, got a picture of the human appendix right beside a horse appendix. 1998, Growler's Encyclopedia finally admits, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Its removal also increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. Oh, wait, you mean it had a function? Yeah, it does. So young people, when you hear somebody say, well, vestigial organs prove that here's what I want you to do, okay? I was in a debate down in New Zealand one time. I was debating a surgeon. Right in the middle of the debate, set him up, basically got him to admit that there's design. He got mad. But the body's full of vestigial structures that we don't need. That's proof of evolution. I looked at him. This was being televised, right? Looked at him, looked at the cameras and said, all right, you've had medical training. I've had medical training. How about we take these cameras into a sterile operating suite and I'll just cut out all of your vestigial structures. You know what? He didn't want to do that. Because deep down he realizes they have a function. What about this? How many of you in here have heard of like Neanderthal man, loose, those kind of things? We get sold this idea that, you know, we found these bones that surely prove we evolved, right? Again, going back to this guy right here, who planted those seeds that we descended from the apes. In fact, in his second book, look at what he writes. There is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. Okay, How many apes have you ever seen take a piece of carbon, write out a song, take a musical instrument and play it? Or write a poem and read it? They don't do that, do they? And yet, again, here's what we get. I'm going to fly through this really quickly just because I do want to save some time for your comments, your questions. The guy on the right, his scientific name is Ardipithecus ramidus cadaba. He goes by Artie for short. You notice big bold heading, how apes became human. Young people, anytime you see something like that, here's what I want you to ask. Remember this question: where's your evidence? Okay? Because when you look at what they actually got, that's it right there on the screen behind me. In fact, let me kind of orient you. If you look up here, top right, you got some finger bones, a single toe bone. Those are molars or back teeth, part of the head of a femur. Everything in the middle, those are all teeth. Part of the mandible of a jaw, long bones of the arm. That's all they've got. By the way, you'll notice they're in 5 different little boxes, outlined by little white lines. Reason they're in 5 different boxes, those fossils were found in 5 different locations. That's a big deal. And yet, take a look at what the authors admit. They said, Hal Celeste and his colleagues haven't collected enough bones yet to reconstruct with great precision what Cadaba looked like. But they do know that it was about the size of a modern common chimpanzee, which when standing averaged about 4 feet tall. All right, so we haven't collected enough bones yet to know what this guy looks like, yet we're going to put his picture on the cover of Time and in a 2-page spread. Yeah, but that's not the best part. Here's the best part. In that article, they've got a picture of the toe bone with a caption that says, "This toe bone proves the creature walked on 2 legs." All right, let me remind you, I got a doctorate in anatomy and neurobiology. Okay, spent a lot of time looking at anatomy. Human foot, 26 bones in each one. They got 1. In fact, if you remember, that's the only bone they got below the head of the femur. And they're going to say, this toe bone proves the creature walked on 2 legs. Look at what else they had buried in this article talking about the toe bone. They said not only is it separated in time by several 100,000 years, it was also found some 10 miles away from the rest of those bones. Guess it just walked away? I mean, really, let's be honest. Let's say you're out here digging, right? You find some fossils 10 miles on the other side of Castle Rock towards Denver. Your friend calls you and says, "Hey, I found a toe bone. I think it goes with your collection." You know what you'd say? "You're nuts." And even using their own dating system, they're saying this thing dated several 100,000 years different. Man, that dude must have been using olive oil. What I want to do is I want to share with you what I call evolution's Hall of Shame. Okay, these are some of my favorites. I'm only going to show you about 2 or 3. This guy right here, he's my favorite. Nebraska Man. Nebraska Man was actually presented during the Scopes monkey trial as proof that evolution's real. Okay, they then put this picture in the Illustrated London News, 1922, saying, "Hey, this is Nebraska Man and his wife." Remember that question I told y'all to ask? Where's the evidence? You know, where's your evidence that this is real? Because if you're going to use it as trial, you know, put picture in a major paper, all the evidence comes from a single tooth. Looks like 4 on my screen. That's actually the same tooth taken from 4 different vantage points. From that one tooth, we get that dude and his wife. Here's the beautiful thing. After they named it, used it in a courtroom trial to support evolution, put it in an international paper, they later discovered that that one tooth actually belonged to an extinct pig. There's your real Nebraska Man right there, okay? Or how about this guy, Piltdown Man? Again, we ask that question. Where's the evidence? You're going to tell me that I evolved? Where's the evidence for it? This time we got to go to a gravel pit, Piltdown, England, 1912, where researchers discovered first pieces of a skull, pieces of a jawbone. They alerted the world. They said, hey, we found the missing link. And for 40 years, folks, 40 years, this guy was touted as the missing link. Took us 40 years to realize we've been lied to. Because what they actually had done was they took a fairly modern human skull and they broke it on purpose. They took the jawbone of an orangutan, filed down the back teeth of that orangutan to make it look more human, dipped the whole thing in acid to age it, and then they buried it. And guess what? They came along later and found it, named it, basically made all kinds of money from it, and lo and behold, they said that was our missing link. Or how about this one? Neanderthal. Now, I realize there's some ladies in this room that you think your husband lives like one. That doesn't mean evolution is true, okay? This is National Geographic's cover boy. They love him, okay? By the way, moms and dads, real quick, talked to an elder of the church. He was in his mid to late 60s. And he was telling me how that he had left the church. In fact, he completely abandoned, was now an atheist. And as I was talking to him, trying to figure out what was going on, he eventually got around to telling me when he was young, he remembered his parents subscribed to 2 magazines, Life and National Geographic. And he told me how he remembered going down into the basement, having those National Geographics, and he said those images had stuck with him all of his life, and he just couldn't harmonize the Bible with those pictures. Guess which one he chose to believe? This dude was an elder. There you see what's allegedly a Neanderthal skull in the foreground, in the background, a modern human skull. And as you look, you'll notice basically the only difference right across here, that prominent brow ridge. So they would say that this is our closest ancestor, right? That Neanderthal's the guy who gave rise to Homo sapiens. So in their textbooks, here's what our kids see. They see the apes, big quadrupeds walking on all fours, eventually giving rise to this guy. And yet here's what they're not told. They're not told in 1958, a guy by the name of A.J. Cave examined those fossils, and he proved that it was nothing more than a guy who had suffered from advanced stages of arthritis. Question, does arthritis change bone structure? Anybody in this room have family members that maybe have something like osteoporosis, arthritis? Does that change bone structure? Yeah. Does that make them a missing link? Okay, think about this for just a minute. In this room right now, we probably got at least 1 or 2 of you who've either got arthritis and don't know it, or maybe you've already been diagnosed. Now, add to that, in this room, we have variation. What do I mean by variation? I mean, we got all sizes and types. Again, back when I was dissecting humans, you get all kinds, different sizes, ages. In this room, as I'm looking at you, I see normal size heads, I see little heads, I see fat heads, I see all kinds, right? So we've got variation, we've got diseased. You know what's funny? If we were fossilized right now, there are some of you in this room, you would qualify as Neanderthals. I'll point you out later on. What I want you to understand, folks, is just because something a little bit different doesn't make it a missing link. Oh, by the way, anybody in this room think that if something gets buried and compacted and compressed, it might actually be a little bit different anyway? Oh, and by the way, if we're taking 30 or 40 bone fragments and teeth from 5 different other locations, you think maybe that puzzle didn't get put together exactly the way that God originally had it? Young people, here's what I want you to remember. God made apes. He made monkeys, chimps, all kind of stuff. And he also made man. And he told man, he said, you are to be the dominion keepers over everything. There's a reason why you have a brain, a voice to speak, and can build on knowledge. And oh, by the way, God had a plan for man, and that plan was, I love you so much, I'm going to send my son to die for you. He didn't do that for the apes, the monkeys. Please understand, big consequences if you start buying into this idea, oh, we evolved from Neanderthal. Because if you really believe that whole, evolutionary pyramid deal, ask yourself, at what point did God look down and say, okay, now I'm going to give it a soul? Now I'm going to send my son. Why human? Why not? Why didn't he do it when we were like Neanderthals or Homo habilis or Lucy? Because all of that is a fairy tale. I am going to stop right here because I told you guys I wanted to have a few minutes to answer your comments, your questions. If you need to vent your spleen, now is the time. I think Kevin is going to probably maybe run around with a microphone.